morning and thank you for joining us. We're going to spend some time today talking about E-2 visa options where the investment amount is low or cases that are more risky. A few things before we get started. Some of you may know that this firm was founded on an E-2 visa over 8 years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US personally on an E-2 visa, so is very familiar with what you're going through. We have renewed the E-2 visa for the firm once and can also share that experience. The firm is a full service immigration firm, but focuses primarily on E-2 visas. We've processed hundreds of them, and we typically process E-2 visas that are higher risk, meaning lower investment amounts. We process at consulates around the world, but our primary two consulates are Toronto and London. We'll continue this webinar series, doing at least 2 webinars a month on different topics. We have several webinars coming up, and I'd refer you to our website to see those. At the end of this webinar, we'll send out a few things. So one is the PowerPoint that you'll see here today. The other is a comprehensive E-2 visa guide, and also a link to where you can sign up to our additional webinars. My name is Kelly LeGrand-Wiener. I'm the managing attorney at Scott Legal, and I will be your panelist today discussing the E-2 visa issues. If you have any questions, please send them to the chat box. We'll try to answer them either throughout the presentation or towards the end. We'll leave time for questions. Finally, this webinar will be recorded and will be made available on demand. So let's get started. So let's look at the E-2 visa requirements. First requirement is you must be a national of a treaty country. There's a list of several countries that have treaties with the United States, and you must be on that list in order to qualify for the E-2 visa. Second, if you are applying as an E-2 investor, then you must own at least 50% of the E-2 company. If you're going to be an employee, then the company can be owned, the E-2 company can be owned 50% by treaty country nationals. You must make an investment. Your investment must be at risk and irrevocably committed. So this means that when you make your investment, the money must actually be spent. It cannot just kind of sit idle in a business bank account. You must also show that there's a legitimate source for your investment, so that the funds come from non-criminal enterprises. So things like personal savings, a gift from a friend or family member, a sale of property. Loans can also be used as long as the loan is not secured by the assets of the E-2 business. Your investment must also be substantial, which we'll talk about more later. Typical E-2 expenditures for startup companies include things like inventory, equipment, website, office supplies, commercial space, marketing, setting up your entity. We'll also talk more about common E-2 expenditures later in the presentation. But when it comes to the expenses, you want to think about what do you actually need to get your type of business up and running. So these expenses are going to be, different depending on the type of company that you're starting. Another requirement is that your business cannot be marginal. It must support more than just the investor and their family. What this translates to is that you need to hire US employees. So for startups, usually you'll show this in a business plan, including 5 years of financials. That includes a personnel plan showing that you plan to hire employees within that 5-year period. We generally recommend trying to hire somewhere between 3 to 5 full-time employees by the 5th year of operations. Another requirement for the E-2 is that your business must be real and operating. So for startups to prove real and operating, you're going to have things like, proof that you've created a website, that you've gotten a tax ID, that you obtained any necessary business licenses, proof that you've signed a commercial lease, that you've established your LLC or your corporation or sole proprietorship. If you've already signed contracts with customers, or perhaps you have letters of intent or memorandums of understanding, those can all be included as well to show that the business is ready to start operating once you get the E-2. If you're buying a business that's already operating, then, for proof of real and operating, you would include things like tax returns, payroll statements, active contracts, invoices, just showing the business has some commercial activity. So you must also show for the E-2 that you are coming to develop and direct the E-2 enterprise. So the E-2 is not for people who are pursuing, kind of passive investment. It is for people that are planning to actively run their company. Additionally, the E-2 visa is a non-immigrant visa, so you do have to show intent to return to your home country upon the expiration of the visa. The standard for showing this, though, is quite low. Usually you can show it just with signing a statement that says you intend to depart the US at the end of your, E-2 visa, timeline. This doesn't prevent you from renewing the E-2 visa, and the visa can be renewed indefinitely. So looking more into depth about, who can apply and the length of the visa, as I mentioned in the other slide, the treaty investor visa is for nationals of certain countries to come to the US to develop and direct the operations of an enterprise in which they've invested. So only those treaty country nationals can apply. For the E-2 visa, you can either purchase an existing business or you can start up a new business in the United States. Um, in terms of the treaty countries, they're really treaty countries from all over the world. There's publicly available lists you can look at if you have any, questions about, whether you qualify. Unfortunately, China and India are not on the list, so it's not possible for nationals of India and China to apply for the E-2. However, for the E-2, it's really based on where you are a national of at that current time, not where you were born. So, for example, we have clients sometimes that become citizens of Grenada and have been able to apply for the E-2 that way, or people that maybe were born in India or China, and then perhaps they moved somewhere else, perhaps they moved to Canada and became Canadian citizens. They're also able to apply for the E-2 visa. In terms of how long the visa can be granted for, visas can be granted for anywhere from 3 months for up to 5 years. The length of time that it will be granted for is dependent on something called a reciprocity schedule. So it's largely based on the amount of time that the other country also provides to U.S. citizens going for a similar type of visa. So, for example, places like Canada, London, or the UK, they can grant the E-2 visa for 5-year periods. They have discretion to grant it for a shorter amount of time, but very often they're granting it for 5 years. Then there's other places like Egypt and Bangladesh, where the reciprocity period is only 3 months. If you get an E-2 visa that's valid for 3 months, you're able to use that visa to enter the US, and then you can, stay for 2 years. So every time you enter, whether you have a 5-year visa or a 3-month visa, you're going to get 2 years in E-2 status. If you have a 5-year visa, then you can just travel, out of the US at or before the 2 years and re-enter. If you have a 3-month visa, then at the 2 years, you would need to travel, and get a new visa if you wanted to, to keep running the company. So let's look at how much investment is enough. So there is no set minimum amount, but the amount must be substantial in light of the type of business you're starting. For example, a service-based business like a consulting firm or a law firm is going to have a lower startup cost than perhaps a car manufacturer or a restaurant, where there are large fixed costs to get things set up. So for lower amounts, and when I say lower, I mean really anything under kind of 150,000 or 200,000. You want to be able to say that you've spent 100% of the cost to set up the business. So you should consider what are reasonable startup costs for your type of business. What do you actually need to start operating? What we use for this is a proportionality test. So how much money you've invested versus the usual costs to establish that type of business. So you can to kind of support evidence, that you've invested 100%, you can include things like market research reports, industry reports that support, what the startup costs are for your type of business. Sometimes there are, business magazines like Entrepreneur Magazine, for example, that will have these types of articles where they talk about what normal startup costs are for particular types of business. that can be very helpful in supporting your argument that you've spent 100% of the cost to set up your company. You may also consider having a CPA look at your business plan and your proof of investments. If it's a CPA that often works with your types of business, small or medium businesses, they can write a letter that confirms that, based on their experience, you spent everything necessary to get the company up and running. If you are purchasing a business, then in terms of what's substantial, if it's a not a transaction with a related party, but it's just somewhat on the open market, then the purchase price is generally going to be considered a substantial amount because that's what was being offered. That's the fair market value of the business. So let's talk about some strategies to deal with a low dollar amount. It's helpful to look at what is the overall strength of the E-2 application. If you're going to have a low dollar amount, then you know that your investment part of your application is a bit on the weaker side. So then it becomes extremely important to make sure that the other parts of the application are extremely strong. So you want to have a really strong kind of real and operating section. A really strong marginality section. You want to show that you have contracts with clients, you have letters of intent for people who want to work with you. Perhaps you've reached out to the local business community. You may get a letter from, a local chamber of commerce indicating they've met with you and they are excited for your business to join their community. Any other kind of relevant trade or business organizations with which you formed partnerships or have, formed connections. Additionally, if the company has already started to operate, perhaps you've already hired an employee to get things up and running while you wait to get your visa. Those are all really helpful to show that despite the low investment amount, you've spent everything necessary to get the business up and running and that you have the ability to, get that business to a place where it won't be marginal, where it will be supporting employees and making a strong economic impact. So let's look at two examples. So one, you're opening a business and you have a low investment amount, but you've hired 2 employees and you already have revenue, 80,000 per month, and you've already signed clients. Let's contrast this with you're applying for an E-2 visa with a low investment amount. You don't have any more money to invest. You want to wait to hire until after your E-2 is approved and you come to the US. So, obviously the first example here is much stronger. This in this case, in example 1, we have someone who has a risky case because of the low investment amount, but has really done a lot of things to get the case to be quite strong. So already has employees. That's, having US employees is always going to be really, really favorable for the E-2. Already has clients. So already proving, yes, I've spent a low amount, but I've shown that spending that low amount has already gotten me to the place where my business is operational and successful. So most places are going, lots of people are going to fall kind of in a middle ground between these two examples, right? So maybe, you don't have, 10 clients, you're not already taking in revenue, but perhaps you've hired an employee, an office manager or something like that to get things up and running. And perhaps you have a few letters of intent from people that say, yes, we are, willing to sign a contract once you get your E-2 visa. That situation, is obviously much better than if you're applying for an E-2, you have a low investment amount, and you kind of don't take these additional steps to get the case to a stronger place. So let's talk now about some common E-2 visa expenditures, particularly for people who are applying with kind of service-based businesses. It's a very common question: what should I spend money on? So as I mentioned earlier in the presentation, the startup expenses are obviously going to vary based on what type of business you're starting, but there are some expenses that kind of span across most businesses. So, one, website setup and hosting. Really most businesses these days are going to have some type of website, even if it's very bare bones. And it's very common for the consular officer to Google the business or look at the URL before the interview. So it's really important to have, a good website. And even if the website's not going to be a major part of your business, you want to have some kind of web presence. So the officer, when they look for you, is able to see that this is a real business. Other good expenditures include things like computers, printers, scanners, anything that you buy for yourself, anything that you purchase for employees in the future. That can also be a good way to get your expenditures up. Let's say that you're going to hire 3 employees in year 1. Perhaps you would have waited to buy that equipment until you hired them, but because you need to get your expenditures up, you might buy that buy that equipment sooner. If you have inventory for your business, this is a great expense, very tangible, very good thing to get. It doesn't have to be purchased in the US. Any shipping costs that you pay to ship it over can also be included as an E-2 expense. Furniture, but only if it's used for business purposes. So you can't kind of furnish a home and say, well, this is my home office. You really want to, it should be clear that this is, furniture for commercial space. If there's any trademark or IP, involved in your business, you may include that. There's different ways to value that. Any payments you make to employees, if you hire an employee, and so you also need to get a payroll service set up, any payments you make to the payroll service. Legal fees can also be included, if you have anything that you paid to kind of get your business entity set up. Additionally, fees for the actual immigration services can be included, although they're not the strongest. Some consulates will make an issue of it, but generally we do include them. And most of the time they are accepted as a valid startup expense. So commercial space, you can also prepay your rent for, a number of months, but you can only include what you've paid. So sometimes people will ask us, I've signed a lease and I'm committed to pay this, amount over the course of a year. Can't we include that? So unfortunately, no, we can only include the amount of money that has actually been spent at the time that we submit the application. So anything you paid for office supplies, any utilities that you pay, training courses can sometimes be included. It really depends, very kind of case specific, whether it's, makes sense or not to include it. Any fees that any license fees, let's say that you're getting any, some type of software for your company, you can include those expenditures. If your business is the type that requires you to attend a lot of kind of trade shows, that can sometimes be included. Although, as we'll discuss in the next slide, you would really only include the fee for the entry. You would not include, kind of food, travel costs, things like that. If you're purchasing, land for your company and it's a relevant startup expense, that could certainly be included. A car or a truck sometimes can be included, really only if it has a direct tie into the business. So if your only reason is that you need to have a car to get to and from work, that's not going to be a good E-2 expense. If you have a food truck business, if you're having a taxi service, if you have the type of business where you're going to be kind of wrapping your vehicle in some type of advertising and registering it as a commercial vehicle or purchasing it in the name of the company, those all lend themselves more to utilizing a car for an E-2 expense. Any softwares that you need, any kind of marketing or advertising fees, that you have, those can all be included as well. All right. Someone has asked here, when you say the purchase of a business, should it also include the land purchase? For example, if the land is on lease, but buying the business, should this case be eligible for the E-2? So I mean, it can't, I guess it can include the purchase of the land, as I mentioned here. If the land is part of the business, then you certainly can include it. But not all businesses encompass land. Sometimes you'll purchase a business and you'll take over a lease as a subtenant. That's also acceptable. So let's look at some, we just talked about some kind of good, strong expenditures. Let's talk about some bad expenditures. So things like travel, accommodations like hotels, any meals, transportation, any entertainment, expenses directly reimbursed by a client, expenses paid to related parties. So, travel comes up a lot, as does kind of related costs with travel. Unfortunately, it's really not a strong expense. Many consulates actually will actively say on their websites, do not include this. We don't like to include it because even if it brings your investment amount up, it's not looked on favorably by the officers, and they'll feel that you're padding your application, and it actually can work against you to include these types of things. When we talk about expenses paid to related parties, many people own multiple businesses. Perhaps they're paying money from one business they own to another business they own. It can be hard to really argue that those funds are really irrevocably committed and at risk, because the officer may view it as just the person essentially moving money from one account they control to another account they control. So you really want to be careful with any expenses paid to related parties. Ideally, the expenses are going to be paid to non-related parties, and if you do have some expenses paid to related parties, they should be on the smaller side, and the bulk of your expenditures should be, paid to people, companies that are not related to you. So let's talk about some common challenges and tips for consulting businesses. So theoretically, very low investment amount can be sufficient to start a consulting business. We have many people that come to us and say, I have the expertise, I have a computer I bought years ago, I'm going to have a home office, I don't need to spend any money. How can I still get this visa? Ultimately, the E-2 visa is an investor visa. So there is no way to get around the fact that you do have to invest some money, to get this visa. So even though hypothetically you could start off your consulting business spending almost nothing, for the visa, you need to make expenditures. And those expenditures, it will, we can talk about this more later. It will depend a bit on where you're applying, but if you're applying at a friendly consulate, then the minimum investment you want to look for is somewhere between kind of $35,000 to $50,000 spent, and then ideally, another $50,000 put in a business bank account. So you're somewhere in the neighborhood of 65 to 100,000 total, including your expenditures plus your working capital. So they want to know that you've spent enough that you're committed to successfully developing your enterprise. And in particular for, consulting businesses, they also have a concern that people just are going to come in and operate as a solo consultant. And that's not what the E-2 visa is for. The E-2 visa is for people that are going to support more than just themselves and their families, so that are going to hire employees. So you want to, the investment really needs to be made, the business plan needs to be prepared. All those things are really important to show that you're going to build a company that's larger than just you. And that you've invested the funds such that you're actually committed to successfully operating the enterprise. So, kind of going over some of the things we talked about previously, for office space, you can prepay for 6 to 12 months. You can invest in equipment for the employees that you plan to hire, in years 1 and 2. You can invest in perhaps, a website, a bigger website than you had planned on, or perhaps hiring a marketing firm. You can hire employees, and any ancillary expenses you have for those employees, you can include. So we always like to advise people to spend money on things that are important for your business's success. You don't want to just spend money to spend money, but you may kind of move up some of the expenditures. Perhaps you didn't plan to hire an employee in year 1, but you do it because it helps you to get to strengthen the application and to actually start, your business. Similarly, you may not need to, you may have planned to buy yourself, a new computer for the business in year 2, but you would purchase it earlier because it helps for your E-2 expenditures. So let's talk about some E-2 visa challenges for real estate investments. So, this webinar is about kind of E-2s for low investment amounts and risky cases. And real estate companies are generally quite risky as E-2 ventures. So, a big challenge for these types of cases is that a lot of consulates and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services are going to scrutinize the enterprise more closely to ensure it's an active company and not just passive real estate ownership, or flipping homes on a small scale. They're very wary of people who say, well, I purchased one I purchased a property, I put it in the name of an LLC, and I'm going to flip that property. So that's just, it's not going to be considered an active enterprise that qualifies for an E-2. If you're going to do any type of house flipping, it really can only work on a very large scale. So for example, we had a client who had purchased about 50 homes, had a portfolio of 50 homes, and was doing all the renovations on those homes and was then selling those homes. So on that large of a scale, that type of real estate development can be done. But, for people that are purchasing one home, two homes, things like that, house flipping is really not going to qualify for the E-2 visa. It's frowned upon, by the government. You also want to make sure that you have the proper licenses and an explanation for why you're allowed to run this business, as real estate is a very regulated industry, and from state to state, they all have their own licensing requirements. You want to make sure you've investigated those requirements and are familiar with them and have a plan for how you're going to be able to run your business in compliance with these requirements. You can also kind of combine different real estate services to make sure it's an active business. So let's say that you do want to do house flipping. You need to have kind of some other activity that's the main activity of the business. And then you could add house flipping as another ancillary service line. So let's say that you're going to do kind of renovations and construction in your company, and you also want to have a side business in house flipping. That's fine. You can certainly do that, but you need to show that, the main service line is going to be that renovation and construction services. So they feel comfortable that you're going to be able to really hire employees and run an active business. Um, some other ideas for real estate companies that have been successful, a brokerage firm, real estate management. So, property management services are something where clearly you can hire employees. If you're going to do, as we discussed, renovation or construction or house flipping. But again, for any of these, you really do want to investigate your licensing requirements and make sure you have, construction is also a very regulated industry. And so you want to make sure you have an explanation for how you'll be able to run this business. So another risky, type of E-2 business that comes up a lot are E-2 visas for equity trading companies. So similar to the real estate, where placing a home you own in the name of an LLC is not going to be active enough. Placing your stock portfolio in the name of an LLC as an E-2 investment is not going to qualify, for the visa. The similar challenge to real estate is you have to convince the government you have an active business and you're not just engaging in personal trading or trading for just family and friends. This is also a regulated industry, so you have to be able to show you have necessary licenses or explain how your business structure allows you to work within this regulated industry. So similar to real estate, kind of the larger the scale on which you're doing this, the more likely it is to be accepted as a legitimate business. So when you're putting together your application, ideally you're going to have some evidence that you have clients lined up, kind of beyond your friends and family, and that you have the proper licenses to do this, and that you'll actually be able to hire employees based on the scale of your business, over time. So let's talk about some reasons for E-2 denials. You know, low investment amount is obviously one of them. As we discussed earlier in the presentation, there's many things you can do to try to fix this, make the other parts of the application as strong as possible, hire employees, have clients ready to go, or even start the operation to show you have the ability to take in revenue, before you apply. Another way, if you have a low investment amount and the officer or USCIS takes issue with it, if you have more to invest, you can always invest more and reapply. So if you're denied for a low investment amount, there's nothing that stops you from resubmitting with additional proof of investment, plus some of the proof we talked about, the CPA letter, the market research reports that might help support your argument that you still spent a substantial amount in light of the total costs of setting up the business. Other reasons for denials, the nature of the business can sometimes be difficult. So the things we talked about, real estate, equity trading companies, those types of businesses, are ones where the officers are just going to scrutinize them more closely. So it's especially important you have a strong application if you're in one of those fields. Similarly, consulting businesses, you really want to make sure the officer feels comfortable that you're not planning to come in just as a solo consultant, that you really do plan to, scale your business, hire employees, and not just be, a solo. Other things that can come up, filing location and venue. So it's important to discuss with your attorney what your options are. Like whether or not it's beneficial for you to file from within the United States. That's an option for some people if they're here in valid status. Certain consulates are just more friendly than others. Certain consulates are more willing to approve low investment amounts. Some consulates largely see big multinational companies that may have made investments of millions of dollars. In that type of case, for those consulates, it may be harder to get an approval with a smaller investment amount. So it's an important thing to discuss with your attorney. And also the, ultimately filing venues and their friendliness are kind of always changing, since consular officers, kind of change where they are over the years, and that can change, how these visas are adjudicated. So it's a good thing to just speak with your attorney about, and figure out what your options are. If you have a business in your home country that you've run for several years and you never hired employees, this can be a really big red flag. That can be something that's hard to overcome because, the officer may not believe your business plan because you've already done this business and had not hired employees. So, one good thing to do to combat this is to actually hire employees before you file. So you've kind of cut them off at the knees in terms of that argument. Another is a concern over whether the business will create jobs for U.S. workers. A strong business plan is going to be, really important here. Even more compelling is obviously hiring and paying an employee, before you apply. There can also be just issues with the adjudicating officer. Many of our clients report very positive experiences, but there are always some negative experiences. Sometimes the officer, takes issue with the application for some reason, or has, suspects there's fraud, or is, perhaps doesn't understand the requirements. That also can happen. So it's always important when that happens to be as polite as possible, because the officer does have complete discretion over whether to grant the visa, and then to ask the officer what they were unhappy about with the case. As I mentioned, you can, reapply. There's nothing that prevents you from reapplying after a denial. And if you know what the officer was unhappy with, then that will give you the opportunity to address it in your new application. Another reason for denial can be you just didn't meet the requirements at the time of filing. So if perhaps, the country is not 50% owned by treaty country nationals, or you just have not invested any money. So if you put $100,000 in a business bank account, you haven't really made any investment. So you just didn't meet the requirements. So for those types of objective things, generally you can, kind of look at what they were unhappy with, and then resubmit once you've addressed those concerns. Let's talk a little bit about E-2 visa adjudication trends and hot topics. So questions that were, coming up over the past couple of years were whether the approval rate would change under the Biden administration. So, the approval rate for E-2s really didn't change under the previous administration, and it really didn't change again under the Biden administration. So, generally E-2 approvals have stayed consistently high through both administrations. In terms of adjudication times, unfortunately, because of the backlogs from, the global pandemic, E-2 visas are not being adjudicated faster. That's really has nothing to do with either administration. It really is just a function of, global, shortages and staffing, and caused by the pandemic. There used to be something called Buy American, Hire American, also called BAHA. The way that we saw this play out for E-2 visas at the consulates was that some consular officers were asking for, harder on E-2 employee applicants, asking, why a U.S. worker couldn't do the job, and also, more of a concern for wanting to see investment actually made in the United States. So those, I think, those BAHA has been revoked, so is no longer out there. But I think generally it's also good to just kind of keep in mind that the officers may still ask about these things, and you want to be prepared to answer, those types of questions. So, talking about kind of timelines a little bit more deeply, consulates are many consulates are processing E-2 petitions. There are some consulates that are so backlogged that they are not currently accepting new E-2 visa petitions. For example, right now, Colombia is one of those consulates. We hope that that will change. And over time, for last year, in 2021, there was a period of time where, the consulates in Turkey weren't accepting new e-visa applications. Now they are accepting them. So, the trend has generally been positive, but there are still definitely delays at many consulates. And things are really not back to where they were, prior to the pandemic. An option that can come up if you're already in the United States in valid status is you could extend your status if you're here as an E-2, and you don't want to travel for some reason, or you're not able to get a visa appointment in time. You can extend your status with USCIS. If you do that, and this is your first filing with USCIS, they will want to see all of the E-2 documents, including the proof of the initial investment and the source of funds. So that's something to keep in mind, is that they will adjudicate it as a brand new E-2 application. When we talk about going to USCIS, which is a filing from within the United States versus going to a US consulate where you attend a visa appointment at a US consulate outside the US, there's some pros and cons. So USCIS, if you change or extend your status, you're going to get a 2-year approval. And that approval doesn't allow you to travel internationally. It just allows you to stay in the United States and to run your business. Additionally, filing with USCIS, they're very, very strict about the source and trail of funds for the investment. They want to see a dollar for dollar accounting of exactly where the money came from. We contrast that with the consulate. Consulates are generally more concerned with the big picture. They're not generally not going to dig into the details of a dollar for dollar accounting, as long as there is kind of general evidence that shows the money came from a legitimate source. They're generally going to be satisfied with that. Another large benefit of going to the consulate is you can get a visa stamp in your passport, which allows for international travel. So for many countries, that means you can get up to a 5-year visa stamp and travel freely in and out of the United States while you run your business. So some issues that come up with E-2 visas. One question that comes up: do I have to hire employees before I apply for an E-2 visa? No, you don't. You absolutely don't. It's not a requirement. For startups, it's very clear that you can apply with a 5-year business plan that shows, a personnel plan that you plan to hire employees over 5 years. However, it is very helpful to hire employees, if you're able to. But many of our clients, I'd say, in fact, even most of our clients do not and are still able to be successful. But it can be very helpful, especially if you have some of the risk factors that we discussed earlier. Other things that come up, complicated source and trail of funds. So for USCIS filings, as I mentioned, you'll need an exact dollar for dollar accounting. So if somebody gifted you the money and it came through multiple accounts and they can't really show you where that money came from, that's really not going to work for a USCIS filing. Even if you get a gift, you need to have a gift letter, but you also need to explain the source of that gift. So if somebody gave you a gift and they had sold their property to give that to you, you would need proof of the sale of property, proof of the gift giver receiving the money, proof of them transferring the money to you, and you would need to document every stage of that process clearly. For loans, loans are acceptable as a source of E-2 investment, but they cannot be secured by the assets of the E-2 business. If they're secured by your personal property, so for example, if you get a home equity line of credit, that type of thing can be very straightforward as a good, source of funds for the E-2. Sometimes people want to apply with 2 investors. In that case, you have to have ownership of 50-50 if you want to be both investors. In terms of substantive changes to the E-2 business after filing, things that come up sometimes: people start an E-2 business and then they, want to sell some of their business, or they have investors. So if there's any changes in ownership, you have to make sure that you as the investor continue to hold at least 50% of the company. There are some nuances with this, regarding operational control, but generally 50% of the company always has to be owned by treaty country nationals. And if you're contemplating some type of change where you are going to drop below 50%, you should speak to your attorney before that happens to make sure it doesn't implicate anything negative about your E-2 status. Similarly, if there's a change to the type of business, so let's say that you were a wedding photographer and now you want to open a restaurant, under that same LLC. Before you change your business line, you have to go back to USCIS or to the consulate and get an approval to do that. You cannot just change the business line and keep operating under the same LLC. If you're doing something that's aligned with your initial business offering, so you have a restaurant and you want to, add a food truck out front. That's really aligned with the same work you're already doing. You're still selling food. So that's going to be, pretty much fine. But if you're going to do a substantive change to the type of business, even adding a new business line that's completely outside the scope of what you initially planned, that's something that you need to get approval for first. So you need to speak to your attorney and go to the consulate or USCIS before you start offering that new service line. Other areas that are a bit complex for E-2s are if you're purchasing a business from a family member. So these types of arrangements are inherently more suspect, and you may want to get a third party or objective valuation done to show that the amount that you're purchasing the business for is really the fair market value. And the amount that you're spending should really line up with kind of what you can see in the financials. So if the company is extremely profitable, lots of assets, and you're paying a very low amount for it, the officer may not believe that's really a substantial amount, based on that. So you really want to have that proof, that this is an objective fair market value for the business that you're spending. So we have a few questions that came in. So someone's asked whether you can, if you're on a waiver, if you can apply for an E-2. There's so many different types of waivers. It's not something I could answer on this. It's something we'd have to set up a consultation so we could discuss it. In example one, how is it legal for a Canadian to be running a business and hiring employees without already having an E-2 visa? So the example contemplates that the person is not physically in the United States. You're always permitted to own a company in the United States. You're just not permitted to actively work for that company until you get your E-2 visa. So let's say that you're located in Canada. You've come as a business visitor a couple of times to get your office space, hire an employee, and then you're back in Canada while this person is, this employee is kind of running your business for you. So that's how that works. If I'm putting funds for my savings into the business, how many years of paper trail do I need to provide? The money has been sitting in savings for 3 years. I'm applying outside the US. This somewhat depends on which consulate you apply at. But generally, if you're putting funds from your savings in, then you're going to provide 3 years of tax returns and proof of you transferring that money to your business bank account. All right, so somebody asked whether you can use your Airbnb properties as expenses. It depends. I mean, certain aspects of, it depends what type of business you're starting. So if you're doing a property management company, you've purchased 4 properties and you're going to be running them. I think that's a start. Again, for that type of, only 4 properties, it's going to be considered on the lower side. You may want to have some other expenditures, beyond that. Someone asked, I presume you help clients with the E-2, so be able to share your fees. For fees, please contact us separately. We're happy to send our engagement letter, or if you schedule a consult, we can also send our engagement letter. Deliverables are also, like all the details about our fees and services are included in that engagement letter. So please contact us separately if you have questions about that. Someone asked if you can use loans as the cash portion of your investment. If they are, again, loans that aren't secured by the assets of the E-2 business. So if it's a personal unsecured loan, money from a line of credit, money from, security on a car or a property you own, yes, you can take that money out and put it into your business bank account and use it as the cash portion of your investment. So thank you all very much. And I hope everybody has a nice day. Thank you for your great questions and participation.